and you completely ignore the second half. I said from the book, from the Bible, how many examples do you need? Yes? That shows that during the baptisms, that they did not use the Trinitarian formula. From the book.
They never did it.
The important bit you seem to be missing out is from the book. How many do you need?
I think you're asking two different questions.
No, I think you're still confused. Looks like.
Because you're
Look, that's because you're stuck in the triune formula, and you know very well it is nowhere you can find the example in the Bible. Is that right? Is that right? There's none in the triune formula.
When we have mentioned in the book of Acts, they don't say in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They say in the name of
Not only in the book of Acts, anywhere in the Bible. Is there anywhere in the Bible where you have anyone baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit?
Well, the only places that we have recorded of baptisms are, as in actual baptisms and what's been said there, would be in the book of Acts. All the rest of the New Testament is teaching. So nowhere else is there teaching saying only to do it in the name of Jesus. The only teaching we have in terms of in the Trinitarian formula is in Matthew 28. So saying the rest of the Bible, no rest of the Bible talks about it, in the name of Jesus. But the thing is that presents a big...
Why can't you just say no? Why are you beating around the bush? Just say nowhere does it say, even the book, look, when I say anywhere in the book, it includes the book of Acts, obviously. Why didn't you just say nowhere? Why are you going around in circles for?
Because I like to actually give people information.
No, but the information you're giving is not required. The information you're giving is
you. I think it is required because I prefer to give people a whole picture.
Do you remember my question?
Your question?
Yes, what was my question?
As in give evidence of the Trinitarian formula being practiced.
Yes.
Yeah, and I say the only place you would find that is in the book.
I didn't ask you where you would find. Did I ask you that?
Am I allowed to answer that question?
No, but you see, this is what you've done, Nathan, every time. You somehow seem to waste time. If I ask you, wait a minute, if I ask you what is your name, and you tell me where I live, how I came to Speaker's Corner, how I'm going to go back to my home, I didn't ask you all that.
Hashim, if this is a waste of time, we can end this right now. If you feel this is a waste of
time. No.
What
you're answering, irrelevant questions.
I'm allowed to answer
No, you can. Look, as long, Nathan, as long as it's relevant, I have no issue you answering that way. But, no. But do you really think it's relevant to my question?
Yes.
Okay. Which part of what you said is relevant to my question, other than the fact that nowhere it is mentioned the triune formula has been practiced during baptism?
Because what you're saying, the picture you paint by saying, or it's mentioned nowhere, to actually the picture, well, the only place we would expect it to be is in Acts because of what Acts is compared to the rest of it, paints a different picture.
Okay, so if you didn't mention that, hold on. Let's say if you didn't mention that. Yes? Does it actually change the fact that nowhere is mentioned the triune formula is practiced anywhere in the world? Does it change the fact? So if you just said, look, if you just made it short and said, no, Hashim, it's not mentioned, does it change the fact? It doesn't change the fact. No, it doesn't. It basically is insignificant if you ask me or ask anyone who's listening to this, yes, whether in which book it appears, how many times it appears, all that is irrelevant. If I ask you how many times, then yes, you can say it's mentioned here and here, then that would be more specific. But look, the point is this. If this, and by the way, do you know that the scholars have actually identified this particular verse of the Great Commission? Yes, it was added later on. Have you actually looked into the textual criticism of this?
Yeah. How many manuscripts that have Matthew 28?
What is the earliest manuscript?
No. This is the question. Listen to the question simply.
Yeah.
Because how many manuscripts that have Matthew 28 in it, and will go all the way to that verse, have the Trinitarian formula in it? No.
The question I asked is, was it there in the early manuscripts? Okay. So what is the earliest extant manuscript that has Matthew 28:19?
That has it all the way to, I don't know.
Okay, so you haven't looked into it?
No, all I have looked into is this actually. All the manuscripts that contain Matthew 28 up to verse 19, or verse 20, wherever it is, verse 20 I think it is, contain the Trinitarian formula. What you have some people doing is, they have incomplete manuscripts which don't have up to that verse, and they're saying, it's not in the original. Well, no, it's because that manuscript's not complete. So all the
what do you mean the manuscript's not complete?
As in, manuscripts get damaged. Matthew 28 is at the end of Matthew. So bits that tend to get damaged are the end and start of manuscripts.
No. I think if you listen to the scholars, what they say is that the scholars like Bar Arman, who are textual critics of the New Testament, who are scholars of the New Testament.
Okay, and Bar Arman says Matthew 28.
No, if you listen to them, you'll find, for example, during the.
Okay, can you show me where Bar Arman says it's not in the original?
Well, I don't have the book here now. If you no, but you research it and you have a look instead of laughing like that.
You're wrong. That's why I'm laughing.
You're wrong about what?
I know you're wrong when you're making the claim that Matthew 28 isn't in the original manuscript.
You know how they make their argument? They say, look, if people like, for example, during the councils, if they did not use this particular verse of Matthew 28:19, which happens to be the only verse coming close to some sort of, it's not really proving the Trinity at all, because it doesn't say the three are one. Why did people like Athanasius and all did not use this during the councils? Or the early Christians who talked about the Trinity did not use this as a reference for the Trinitarian arguments?
Are you talking about Eusebius?
Might be Eusebius as well, yes. I think that is a reference Bar Arman gave, yes, about Eusebius.
Because the problem you have with that is Eusebius is around 300-400, okay? You have many before that.
So who uses Matthew 28:19 during any of the arguments before Eusebius? So even Eusebius didn't use it.
So why don't we invite Nathan for food? Let's go to a restaurant.
Yeah.
Invite Nathan as well.
Okay. So everyone else?
It's quite cold. Brother,
yeah, let's go, yeah.
let's go, bro.
I have to go.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
It's mentioned in the Trinitarian formula. It's mentioned in the Didache, which is the 1st century. We have Ignatius in the 1st.
So in the Didache, what does it say exactly?
Talking about being baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
And that was written when?
1st century.
No. The earliest extant manuscript of that.
No. When's it written?
Well, I can say it was written during Jesus' time as well. No. That doesn't prove anything. What is the earliest extant manuscript you have of that?
That's not how textual criticism works. What works is when is the thing written and how can we get back to the original?
No, but when you say, look, when anyone says, they're only assuming it was written there. So this is more of a, it is an assumption. It is not a fact.
No, we can ascertain it's written in the 1st century.
How can you assert something you don't have evidence for?
You're assuming we don't have evidence for it.
Okay, so you have evidence. For example, what is the earliest extant manuscript of the New Testament?
You mean complete?
Not complete.
Or is it?
Even a fragment. Let's say even a fragment.
That's P52, which is dated AD 125.
Yeah, it's not 125. The latest, I don't know if you've seen the latest analysis of that. It falls to either late 2nd century or the early 3rd century.
From who? When's this coming out? When's this come out?
I can give you the reference next time.
Okay,
yes.
Okay.
But it's something that they have dated as at a later date, because earlier they used I think the temple or something as their yardstick in order to.
They give a range. Yeah. The range they gave, two dated it between 150. Two did it one did it from 90 to AD 140, so they did the middle AD 25.
No.
Dating.
Okay. And by the way, do you know that the P52 is size of a credit card?
Yep.
Okay. So the earliest manuscript you have, let's say I go with 125 even, that's still more than 100 years after Jesus.
No, it isn't. AD 25 is not 100 years after Jesus.
Okay, let's say roughly 100 years after Jesus.
Okay, it's of John, which is written in the latest, I'll say about AD 90, that's
again an assumption. You don't have an extant manuscript for that.
Pardon?
You don't have an extant manuscript for that.
Okay, so what's your point?
The point is this. If you don't have an extant manuscript, yes, so how would you know what Jesus said and confirm what he said after 100 years?
So you're saying unless we have a manuscript from that time, we cannot know when that book.
I'm not saying anything. I'm asking.
No,
I'm asking you. I'm not saying anything. I'm asking you. How would you ascertain what Jesus said in the year 30 or 33 when he died, according to your understanding, compared to 125 years after? How would you know that this is what Jesus said? How would you verify? Because obviously those people who are also like Jesus or his companions are no more there to verify this statement. So how will you verify what Jesus said after 100 years?
Exactly. The issue is, I think, from your understanding, I think you are misunderstanding.
No, don't assume what I'm thinking. I'm asking you, how will you verify as a Christian? As a Christian, how will you verify?
we have to ascertain either one or two things. Either I'm allowed to ask questions to clarify your point, or if I'm not allowed to ask questions to understand your point, I just talk. I cannot do either.
No, Nathan, you're not clarifying my point. You're assuming what I'm thinking.
Yes, because before that I asked, can I ask you a question? You were like, no, I'm not allowed to.
So, no, I didn't say you're not allowed to.
Right.
I said you're allowed to ask as long as it's within the context of what we're talking about.
Yes, right. Are you saying then, communicating, your assumption is that unless we have a manuscript, the autographs, we cannot know when a manuscript is written, because we don't have the autographs, we can only know from when the first manuscript is. Would that be a correct assessment of the view you're putting forward?
All I'm saying is that in order for you to find out what Jesus actually preached or what he said, yes? Mm-hmm. Look, for example, Muslim and Bukhari, they were written like 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Yes? We do not say they lived in the time of Muhammad. Mm-hmm. However, they are able to say what Muhammad said based on the chain of narration. And not only the chain of narration, we have something called Ilm al-Rijal, which is basically we know about each individual in that chain of narration, which goes all the way back to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in order to identify whether the hadith is sahih, is authentic, whether it is da'if, whether it is weak, whether it is mawdu, whether it's fabricated, or it's hasan, and so on. So there's different gradings. Yes, it actually has a whole science. There's a whole science. But in terms, because the Christians do not have any of this science, you don't have the oral tradition, you do not have the written tradition, how will you come to the conclusion what Jesus said after more than 100 years since he passed away? That's all my question is.
Okay, well, can I speak and then I won't?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Because the issue, first and foremost, is that the reason that you have the chain of transmission that the Muslims have is because they do history very different to what would have done in Muhammad's time and the time of Jesus. The reason that we can have confidence over what the New Testament says is because the number of manuscripts that we have. Yes, they date even sometimes later to the 3rd and 4th century, but the thing we have with the New Testament is it was never under one person's control. When you have Matthew being written, you have that then being given to people and they transmitted it to different places. You have Mark being written, that's being transmitted to different places. So the manuscripts that we have, they come from all different places, from all different lines. So we can come and bring them together and look, okay, what does the original say? The multiplicity of copies and the fact that no one was ever in control of one copy means that we can see where people have made errors, spelling, mistakes, or even put things in. So that's why we can have confidence over what Jesus said.
That doesn't answer the question. I think you misunderstood the question. Okay. Because all you said is you have multiple manuscripts. Yes? By the way, do you know Bar Ehrman said that majority of the manuscripts do not agree with each other, and there are several thousands of differences. In fact, he says there are more differences in the manuscripts than the number of verses in the entire Bible. Now the important thing is this: if you do not have anyone like Matthew, Luke, John, so on, they all died after 100 years since they have written. So how will you verify what Jesus said?
I just told you.
From this, all you said is, look, the extant manuscripts date 100 years. So there's nothing from the 1st century.
No,
yes?
Again,
you find fragments in the 2nd century, and majority of them are, I think, from the 4th, and some from the 3rd, majority of the 4th century and beyond. So you're talking about 400 years after Jesus, 300 years after Jesus. Who was alive to tell the tale? You do not have oral tradition like the Muslims do. You do not have written tradition like the Muslims do. So what are you depending on? You have no chain of narrations. So even the most weak hadith in the tradition of Islam, even that standard you do not have. Because you don't have the sanad, you don't have the chain of narration. So what are you relying on? Because you don't have the written, you don't have the oral, you don't have the chain of narration. How will you come to a conclusion as to what Jesus said and what he did not say?
Because again, you're not listening to what I say.
I did, because you mentioned the manuscripts, which came hundreds of years after.
You didn't listen to what I said. You didn't understand what I said.
No, I did.
Even when you quote Bar Ehrman, you're quoting him wrong.
No, I did not. I can have the exact quote if you want. I have the exact quote.
Hashim, I let you speak.
Yeah, fair enough. Go on.
The quote you say is correct. What you miss is what he says afterwards. What he says afterwards is that yes, there are up to 400,000 variants. They don't matter for a thing. All they prove is that the people they can't spell any better than his students can. That's what he
That's.
said.
I think you're completely misrepresenting.
Hold on. I'm not
He has written an entire book called Forged.
Hold on.
He's written an entire book which is called Forged with regards to the Bible. But you're misrepresenting Bart Ehrman. You know that.
I'll let you speak. Let me finish.
Did I misquote him?
No.
There you go.
I'm not misquoting him either.
No, you are misquoting him. Because for you to say, he has written. Have you read the book Forged?
No.
Right. That entire book talks about the forgeries of the New Testament. Okay. So it cannot be. His entire book actually tells you that it cannot be relied upon.
Hashim, let me finish.
And they say that many of the things that you.
Hashim, write this down. The quote I'm saying, and I went back because we've had this discussion.
No, I know the Christians use one quote, and they completely ignore the entire works of his.
Hashim, no, because we're going to be.
I think what you're quoting is from one of his interviews, not from one of his books. That was one of his interviews.
I'm quoting from both his interview and a debate. He used both the same response, okay? So the response is that the differences don't matter. When he was asked in the back of misquoting Jesus, do these differences affect Christian doctrine? Even Bart Ehrman admits, no, these differences do not affect Christian doctrine. So you're again misusing Bart Ehrman. What I'm saying with the manuscripts is this. Okay, we have so many that they're sent to different places. Okay, they're sent to different places. So what we can do, we can compare manuscripts. We can go, okay, what is common to them? What is different? What is common to them? Okay, that has to come from the original, because there's no.
Why? Why is that?
I'm going to explain that.
Yes.
Because there's no. If you've got different lines of transmission, how can all say 10 different lines, and it's more than that, but say 10 different lines, how could all 10 of them have the same thing that the original didn't have, unless they came from the original?
Very simple. I'll tell you what, very simple.
How can you corrupt all 10?
It's very simple.
Okay.
To disprove that point, I'll just make one statement and you tell me what you think about it. Let's say let's say an early scribe writes something and he makes a mistake in that. And now you have hundreds and thousands of copies made of that. Yes? They will all copy the exact same mistake. So now we have this same mistake being sent to different places. It can be tens of lines, even hundreds of lines. The point is, it will be repeated. That mistake will be repeated that many times.
Okay.
No, wait. I haven't finished it. I haven't finished. Now, this one mistake that the early scribe made, yes, unless and until it is checked, corrected by someone, yes, this will proliferate every single person who copies from that. Now, how will this mistake be corrected if this verse was written by this scribe and then propagated to different parts of the world, whatever it is? How will it be corrected?
Okay, I'm going to answer.
Go on.
You said, okay, from this one you have others coming off. I agree with you.
Yeah.
They will most likely copy that mistake.
Yes.
But what you're ignoring is the rest of the others that were written at the same time as that scribe who didn't make the mistake.
No, so that is an if.
Hold on.
I'm saying if not. If not, then what?
But your example assumes it.
Of course I am assuming, because so are you assuming. You're assuming that hundreds of them wrote it. Other people also wrote this.
Again, what we're going to notice is this.
Is what?
We have these manuscripts here that say this, and they're in this particular line. Okay, this line of text. We have these here, which are going down different lines of transmission that are going to show us, okay, they don't have it. So what textual scholars do, they go, all right, they notice that they're called text types, that they follow a certain tradition, they have certain verses in that others don't. So we can say, oh, because these ones gone down this line, but others have gone down different lines and they don't have it in, that the most likely is that it wasn't original. So we've considered all of these things. So
it's an assumption then? Yeah, because what you just said is an assumption. That because these lines don't have this and this one has it, so we will assume this is what Jesus said. So it's an assumption.
Yeah.
Can that assumption be wrong?
Are you then saying that, say we have a verse that only goes down one, okay?
Yeah. No, I'm not saying it goes down one. I'm saying it can go down multiple. But because they have copied from the same scribe, this
Well,
that one error will be repeated in these multiple chains.
Yes, but they stem back to one. Okay, they stem back to one. That's not the original.
And how will you correct that one? That's the question.
Listen. You stem. So I don't think you listen to me. You stem back to that one.
Yes.
Okay? What about the other chains which stem back to the original? How are you going to explain?
You don't have the original.
No, but the chains go back to the original.
Which original? You don't have it.
Yes, but they go back to the original. That's where.
You keep repeating the original. There is no orthographic manuscripts you have. So how will you go back to the original?
No, you're not.
What do you mean original? The original example I gave you is this. Let's say you have an early scribe. Let's say it's 90 years after Jesus. Yes, not 125 years. If this scribe, after 90 years, maybe he's heard from someone wherever it is, and you have only this scribe writing this particular verse, and all the others are destroyed or lost or whatever. Yes. How will you be able to correct what this error this particular scribe made if all the previous orthographic versions, all the previous copies of the originals are destroyed? How would you know?
Again, you're not hearing me.
I think I hear you clearly, but it looks like you don't want to accept and acknowledge that there is no way to identify without a chain of narration.
No, again,
you don't even know the scribe's name, let alone the chain of narration. Can you name even a single scribe who have written in the name of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? Because you do. I don't know if you have read.
What you're doing now is called an anachronism. What you're doing
No, it's not an anachronism. It is actually. I gave you even the time. I gave you the time frame from 90 years after Jesus, and you have only this person whose writing has survived, and he has made a mistake in the surviving manuscript. Now, if his manuscript is copied elsewhere, you have multiple chains from him. However, they all contain that error. How will you correct it? Also, how will you verify that? Because what?
Because when the New Testament went out, it didn't go just to one scribe to 90 years and then.
Sorry, when the New Testament went out?
Yes.
When did it go out?
As soon as it was written, it was copied.
When was it written?
Well, for each individual book, you have a time spanning from the 40s up to the 90s. So when a book is written, it's copied by multiple people and sent to multiple locations.
That's not how it worked.
Hold on.
That's not how it worked. Are you telling me the people who wrote, for example, let's say Paul?
Yeah.
Are you saying that Paul actually had access to Mark, Matthew, Luke?
He wrote Matthew
and John.
They came after.
No, did he have access to the Gospels?
He had access to the disciples.
That wasn't my question. Did he have access to the Gospels?
He would have had access to.
Let's say John wrote, according to you guys, he wrote his Gospel in the year 90, for example. So he wouldn't have access to Gospel of John, would he? Okay. So what are you saying? They sent out the New Testament. Somehow you. Wait. No. You told me as a book, yes, of course,
No,
and that is anachronistic.
Hold on. If I said no, you've misunderstood me.
No, I did not.
When I said New Testament, if I conveyed to you that it was sent out as an individual book, then I have conveyed that wrongly. Okay. What you have, the individual books of the New Testament.
Yeah, that's better.
All 27.
Because earlier you somehow seemed to imply that it was one book as the New Testament.
Well, I didn't mean to imply
okay,
that.
Fair enough.
Good
Thing has been corrected.
Or what I was communicating.
Okay.
Maybe I misspoke, which means you got the wrong idea. And instead, what I'm saying is when the individual books, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what Paul wrote, etc., when they are written, each individual of those is sent out and copied many times over and sent to different locations. So if by the time
we don't have evidence for that, do we? You're just assuming all this.
No, that's what.
Are you saying the books were copied over time, many times, and then they were distributed everywhere? Where's the evidence for that?
That's because we have so many different New Testaments.
No. You have later manuscripts. You don't have from that century. You have nothing from the first century.
Okay.
So you are assuming.
How do you think we got to manuscripts from the 4th century?
Because they were written later on.
From what?
From other copies, which were not free from error.
Which were written from. So to get to 4th century manuscripts, do they not have to have copied from something earlier?
Yes, of course.
So either
it could be from the same century, or it could be from earlier period.
What do they all go back to?
But wait a minute. They do not go back unless and until you show me evidence for the originals where they were written.
Are you saying that they did not go back to the originals? Is that your argument?
That's what I've been asking you all along.
So where did
I'm asking you, how can you go back to the originals from the later copies?
So where do they come from?
You tell me. Because look,
no, you're making the assertion.
Hold on.
I'll tell you.
Do you actually believe that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels written in their name?
Yes.
You think they literally wrote it?
Yes.
I don't think you have actually studied this topic.
Okay. So
Go and read it and then have a discussion.
Yes.
Because you haven't. If you say with such assertion and confidence, it means you haven't actually read this topic. Because
Why?
all the scholars, well, I wouldn't say all. I would say majority of the scholars, have come to the conclusion that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John have not written these books
Hashim, when
that
you
were
say
written in their names.
Okay, which scholars?
Majority of the scholars.
Okay, again, I don't use.
But you haven't actually studied this topic.
I have to this topic. I
Okay,
just don't-
so you actually come across any major scholar who says that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, in whose name? Why would they say according to then in the beginning of the Bibles?
Because they had to. Because what you have is they're sent out. You have these 4 Gospels, and you have to differentiate between the 4. So you have to differentiate. So you have Matthew because that's his Gospel. You have Luke because that's his Gospel.
No, if it's his gospel, it will say by Matthew. It wouldn't say according to Matthew.
Why?
Because this is the
who
third
wrote it?
person.
Who wrote it?
That's the question I'm asking you.
Well, if
If it was written,
If Matthew wrote it, would you not say according to Matthew? It's got the Gospel.
no.
according to Matthew.
If it's a third person saying it, then he'll say according to Matthew. But if Matthew wrote it, then he would sign his book by Matthew.
Why? You're assuming
Because he's the one who's written that.
assume that.
Have you seen any author who says according to?
today or back then.
No, I'm saying you. Have you seen any book where it says according to this author?
Today or back then, because again, you're assuming that. You're assuming that.
Even back then. Show me another book where the author wrote it, but then it says according to.
That's,
I think you look,
you're making
Nathan.
assumptions.
With all due respect, I think you should go and read this up because I think this is the conclusion of majority of the scholars that Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These are the pseudonyms that they have written under. They themselves have not written these works. You should really go and look it up.
With all due respect.
Is Paul here? I think Paul can shed some light on it. Is he here?
Rather
Or is he gone?
bring-
He's gone, yeah, okay.
Actually bring forward an argument rather than saying, Nathan, you don't know anything.
I didn't say you didn't know anything. I
That's
said
what
you
you're
have.
saying. That's
No,
what
no.
you're saying.
I'm saying
That's what
you.
you were
I'm saying
saying.
you go and research it.
I have researched.
Okay? And you actually come across any major scholar who says yes, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John actually wrote it. Then we'll discuss.
All I've got is your words. You're just asserting that. You're asserting this is what scholars have said.
No, don't take my word for it. You go and research it.
I have researched.
This is like the
That's why I
third time I'm
believe you're
repeating.
wrong. That's why I believe you're wrong, because I have looked into
Okay,
it.
so if you have researched it, show me one major scholar who says
I
this.
don't use the argument, major scholars say this, major scholars say that.
It is important because look, you and I are not scholars, so we have to rely on them. I have no shame in saying I research and then I ask,
Right.
I look at the works of the scholars.
All right, then.
Okay?
Why do the scholars, according to you, say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by those people?
Why?
Why were Matthew, Mark,
Because of the textual analysis that they have done in the books. For example, some of them were not even learned. So for them to write Greek to such high standard, it itself shows that these people who are be fishermen or someone who's not learned, for them to write such Greek is impossible. That is one example that they give. One analysis that they give of this, which completely disproves anyone who makes a point that these people had written in such high standard of Greek. Okay, so there you go.
Hold on, would a doctor-
Is that fair?
Hold on.
Is that a fair analysis?
But that again, that assumes that they wouldn't be able to do that. But that's
No, because it does. Look,
Look,
for-
can I
if I told you,
can
if
I-
I told you that someone who is a fisherman and he speaks really high standard of Greek, when he doesn't even know how to read and write Greek properly, then for you and me to assume that he knows perfectly Greek and to write to such high standard as a academic, as someone as a scholar, then that would be unfair and it would be actually insincere, to be honest.
Well, you're assuming that they weren't able, they're illiterate and you're not able to read, right?
I'm not assuming. At that time, most of the people were illiterate.
Hold on. Would a doctor be in that position?
Which doctor? Are you talking about Luke?
Yes.
Well, I didn't say all, did I?
Okay, so-
I said some of them.
All right, so let's go.
And by the way, Luke didn't even see Jesus.
Okay.
So where did he get his
Hold on,
information from?
But you said that Luke is a pseudonym, yes?
No, I said Luke. Yes, even Luke himself did not write that book.
No.
The reason for that is because many of the things that Jesus said in the red letter, it is as if Jesus said it verbatim as to what he said. But Luke never saw Jesus, did he?
But what did Luke say?
Did Luke see Jesus any time in his life?
What does Luke say in his first chapter?
Are you going to answer the question?
No,
Did Luke see Jesus in his lifetime? No. So he relied on whom?
First, eyewitnesses.
No, he didn't say eyewitnesses. He said he is asking, he's searching, and it seems good to him to write because it was in vogue. It was in fashion that time. Did he say he was inspired by God? No, he did not say that.
No, what's he saying?
He says,
you're trying to prove at the moment.
he says, read Luke 1:1, the one you pointed out to me.
You're trying to prove Luke didn't write Luke. How does?
I'm not saying this. The scholars are saying
Right,
this.
your argument that Luke didn't write Luke is that Luke didn't see Jesus.
No, but